And then if we're just after 4 o'clock, so Al, I think you are more than welcome to start and kick us off, and I'll let people in as they come.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Mia, and thanks everybody for joining us today. The first of our Zoom talks leading up to our flagship sale at the end of the month. We have our big Johannesburg virtual auction taking place from the 26th to the 28th of July. It includes wine as well as pictures and sculptures. They'll all be sold over 3 days, which is the first time we've done that in a Johannesburg sale. But we're very, very excited about the offering. I understand the first catalogs have just come off the printing press today, so they will start being distributed around the country and around the world, although of course the e-catalog is available on our website. But you'll notice paging through the catalog that we have 10 examples by Alexis Preller, 10 wonderful works by Alexis Preller. I love talking about the artist. Specifically, I love seeing which new works come in and trying to fit them into his story. No matter what, we are always surprised with what Alexis can do. And I suppose always when we assume we've seen most of the gems, one or two inevitably pop up, ones that haven't been catalogued or seen before. An endless, I suppose, stream of excitement for us at Strauss & Company. Anyway, I always like to start with this image when talking about Alexis. It is, of course, the young man in Pretoria. And I always sort of try and pose the question, how on earth this young man with his sort of wingnut ears, polite, gently spoken, conservative, gay man in a hyper-conservative Praetorian society would go on and develop this incredible aesthetic to give us explosive works like the one I'm showing you here. This is The Gates, which is on our sale, and I'll quickly spin through the 10 that will be appearing in our upcoming sale, starting with The Gates, and then this wonderful head of a Mapogga woman, this beautiful background pinks, this very unusual almost carved portrait of a nude from 1939, another unusual work called The Shield, probably dating from the early or mid-1950s, another small, beautiful jewel-like gold abstract from the early 1960s, a very unusual early work, I suppose generically titled Three Figures from the Congo, dating from 1939, this unusual small work with some gesso and some profile, a small work called The Shell, this amazing painting called Surreal Minoan Bulls from 1954, one of the highlights of the sale. Well, certainly one of my absolute favorites, this vast, spectacular Temple of the Sun from 1963, and then arguably the most important work, the most important Preller work in the upcoming sale, The African Head, of which 2 were produced, one of which in an institutional collection, and this the only other opportunity to buy a work of this kind of quality and from this exact period. We always use this quote too when talking about Alexis, the idea that his career has a very direct narrative with a true beginning and a true indication of a conclusion, which is probably one of the reasons why I enjoy Preller's output so much. I think he fits a traditional art historian very well, in that so much of his life is so closely based on his biography and his chronology. You can segment his career so beautifully, and although whilst everything is very much intertwined, and that's a point I'm hoping to make over the next 45 minutes or so, there are very distinct periods of his work, beginning in 1935 and going all the way through to his death in 1975. So we have 40 years of spectacular art making, and it's always nice to place the works in the story. I also always try and mention the dearth of Alexis Preller literature. These really are the only books ever published on Alexis, which is just absolutely staggering when you consider how giant a figure he is in the South African art context. The first was published in 1947. It's this work here, South African Artist by Alexis Preller. It was a very slim volume. Half of it was written by Alexis himself in the third person, the other half by his lover, Christy Truter. As I say, published in 47 by Walter Battis's imprint. And I suppose you can trust Walter Battis to be the first person to publish anything significant on Alexis. We then needed to wait until 1972 for this very, or arguably even slimmer catalogue that accompanied the major career retrospective of Alexis Preller at the Pretoria Art Museum in that year. And again, there's a little introductory piece from Esme Berman, and of course she beefs that up in her Dictionary of South African Artists, but not too much, although it's very well illustrated, this catalogue. And then the main literature, really the foundational text on Alexis Preller, is this double monograph I'm showing you on the right, a book called Collected Images, or Africa, the Sun and Shadows, put together by Esme Berman, the doyen of South African art historians, an art historian that knew Alexis very closely, as well as the current sort of doyen of South African art historians, Professor Carl Nell. Esme is sadly no longer with us, but Carl still, I suppose, leads the way in terms of Preller scholarship. And the two of them produced this remarkable double volume monograph, which, as I say, is very much the Bible of Alexis Preller. Anyway, I implied that so much of his work is biographical, so I will start with at the beginning. Alexis was born a few months before this photograph was taken in 1912. He was born in 1911 in Pretoria. This is, of course, Church Square at that time. What else was going on? Well, the Transvaal University, or current day University of Pretoria, the main arts building, had just been erected in 1910, 1911, when a young Alexis was born. That photograph on the right is Alexis with one of his brothers, Mossi. Mossi is the one with the more masculine haircut. He went on to become a bit of a rugger-bugger. Alexis, who didn't necessarily have the easiest start in life with that hairstyle and frock, went a completely different direction to become one of our greatest South African artists. What else is happening at the time of his birth? It's, of course, a very important political moment. The Union of South Africa in 1910, symbolized by the Union buildings, so Herbert Baker's Union buildings, the foundation stone laid late in 1909, 1910, and completed in 1913. And here's a still shot on the left, and then a wonderful etching by Henk Pierneef on the right from 1911, showing the Union buildings going up on Meintjes Court. This is Johannesburg in 1911. I absolutely love this photograph. You wouldn't believe it was contemporary. 1911, it shows the burgeoning mining scene. It's by a Swiss balloonist, Edward Spelterini, who traveled down to South Africa, went up in his balloon and took these remarkable shots of this now relatively well-established mining town. In terms of the art world, what's going on in the Highveld? Some of my favorite artists are working at their peak, establishing the art scene on the Highveld, starting with the likes of Anton van Gogh, who I'm showing you on the left, Peter Venning, there he is on his wedding day, very much playing to his reputation of being rather miserable. Fani Elof, elaborately photographed, and then this little small figure outside his father's jointly owned tobacconist, that is a young Henk Pierneef. These are the major artists working while Alexis is a young boy. So you had Van Gogh, of course, producing his wonderful desk scale bronzes from 1907. Peter Venning, certainly one of our greatest Highveld landscape painters, producing work like this, which happens to be on our auction too, much to my great excitement. Fani Elof, sort of second generation Eurocentric conservative sculptor, and of course Henk Pierneef needs very little introduction. Frans Oerder was the other major figure on the Highveld at the time. He'd arrived in 1890, had gone back to the Netherlands in 1906, only to return again in the 1930s. But before his leaving, he had, of course, produced fantastic landscape paintings like this. This is Farm Bezuidenhout, or for those of you who know Johannesburg well, Bez Valley. Anyway, Alexis went to Pretoria Boys High. We have this fantastic athletics meet painting by Walter Battis, the artist perhaps most closely associated with Pretoria Boys High. He, of course, taught there for 30 odd years. And this is one of the 2 Pretoria Boys High lots by Walter Battis we have on our sale. But Walter started in 1936, so a good few years after Alexis was there. In 1934, without much direction, Alexis decides to go to London, and he goes with a letter of introduction from Norman Eaton, a letter of introduction to Henk Pierneef, who he hadn't actually met until then, although of course knew very well. Henk Pierneef happened to be in London in 1934, 1935, where he was producing large-scale murals inside of South Africa House, the country's embassy. Along with the likes of Jan Juter and Kurt Steenberg and Guello Goodman and Anton van Vaux and John Henry Amschewitz and Eleanor Esmond White and LaRue Smith LaRue. And a young Alexis walked into South Africa House, which by all accounts stunk of egg, because Jan Juter was working in tempera at the time, although ended up deciding against it. And Alexis met Henk Pierneef, and Henk essentially convinced him not to follow his original idea of going into the acting world or the playwriting world, but rather to try his hand at an art school. And on Henk's advice, he enrolls at the Westminster School of Art. He is faced with a number of hard truths. First and foremost, he realizes that he has very little genuine skill and teaching in drawing. And he is well behind his peers and contemporaries when it comes to drawing. He was very much an out-and-out painter. He drew with a brush as opposed to a pencil, but he realized at this point that he needed to very much upskill himself when it came to drawing. Seemingly, he was a bit of an outcast at the Westminster School, but he did come under the sway of this man on the left. This is Mark Gertler, one of the great British modernists, an artist who was at the Slade in that wonderful golden class alongside Stanley Spencer and Paul Nash and the like. And he was teaching at the Westminster School in the mid-1930s. He sadly gassed himself in 1939, but before that he had an enormous influence over a young Alexis. These are the kind of works that Mark Gertler was producing in the mid-1930s, very chunky, almost neoclassical forms, pasty in their application, as I say, chunky in their form. And Alexis was very much influenced by Mark Gertler. He was also, for the first time, allowed to come face to face with his great early heroes, Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin. He, of course, had never seen their works before going to London, but he was able to spend time in front of pictures like this. And the work I'm showing on the left is a work called The Welsh Farm, one of the late school works he did in London at the Westminster School in 1935. And I think you'll immediately notice not only the very sort of chunky elements in terms of the composition, but of course the sort of gentle post-impressionist color palette that he would have borrowed from Gauguin and Van Gogh. In 1935, he produces this fantastic work called Braying the Reams, which you were lucky enough to sell in 2016, and you'll recognize immediately the debt to Vincent van Gogh. The work on the left is, of course, the Landlord Bridge in Arles in 1888. You'll notice the same sort of crisp blues and these wonderful buttery summery yellows in both the artists' works. Early Preller is very much enlivened by Vincent van Gogh. Showing you this slide to make the point that Alexis Preller had left London in 1935. That is to say, he was not in London in 1936 when the International Surrealist Exhibition took place at the New Burlington Galleries. A hugely important moment in the history of 20th century modernism, one of the landmark exhibitions, but Preller did miss that. And that's important, I'll explain a little bit later, in terms of his complex relationship with surrealism. Anyway, back in South Africa, he exhibits in 1936, he exhibits in 1937, and he also joins the New Group in 1938. The New Group, of course, had been formed by this group here in the Cape, the likes of Terence McCaw and Gregoire Boonzai and Nippy Lipschitz and Florence Zerfie. But the Highveld chapter was really started by Walter Battis, and Walter, of course, pulls in a young Alexis Preller, who is very much the right kind of spirited artist for the New Group. These artists had sort of banded together to produce works that were, I suppose, against the more conservative teaching and school in South Africa, against the sort of heritage of the likes of Edward Roworth, and artists who were, in most cases, European trained or European influenced, and artists who wanted to paint in a more avant-garde modernist spirit here in South Africa. Now, when Alexis exhibited with the so-called avant-garde New Group, he was immediately singled out as the wildest of the lot. And a critic said this of one of his exhibited works: "The picture that is being the most abused, defended, praised, scorned, and jeered at and admired is the ultra-modern Scarlet Nude by Alexis Preller of Pretoria. Preller's picture is, to a conservative, a red scandal in an ecstatic kneeling position, bent as to the knees, twisted as to the arms, and bats in the belfry as to the face, out of drawing and best out of mind." I absolutely love that, because it is a young Alexis Preller, fresh from his training in London, who stands sort of head and shoulders above these other supposedly modernist artists as the wildest member of the New Group. Which leads me on to the first lot, or the second of our sale, the wonderful three figures, Congo, painted in 1939. And when you think of this scandalous Scarlet Nude that he exhibited with the New Group, I think you wouldn't be surprised to see a work like this. I'm showing it to you in its frame. On the right, it has a wonderful period frame. I happen to love this work, and I would like to argue that it's a much more important work than it might first appear. But why on earth is Preller painting Congo figures? Well, it has something to do with a van that would have looked something like this, probably an Austin 7, that Alexis would have acquired sometime in 1939, because he, along with his lover at the time, Christy Truta, had decided to drive from Pretoria up to the then Belgian Congo. Now, making that kind of commitment, making that kind of drive in this kind of a vehicle was beyond ambitious and frankly quite remarkable. But the reason he wanted to do it was he felt he needed to get closer to a more authentic African spirit. Of course, he was, I suppose, culturally European, but he developed a real interest in his idea of an African mystique. And he felt he needed to expose himself to a darker Africa, I suppose, in his mind. And he takes this vehicle all the way through the Vic Falls, up the, 3,500 kilometers up to the then Belgian Congo, and specifically to Lake Kivu. The car is an absolute nightmare. They need to stop every 20 odd miles to clean the spark plugs. Christy, his lover, goes as far as Vic Falls, but has to return to Pretoria because, well, he has a job. But Alexis continues on his own from Victoria Falls all the way up to Lake Kivu. And when he arrives there, he is blown away, enthralled, mesmerized, not only by the landscape, but by the people too. Showing you some sort of semi-contemporary photographs, as well as a volcanic eruption on the right, which is the Nyiragongo volcano that Preller happened to witness erupting when he had arrived there in the August of 1939. Now, I'm showing you this remarkable painting by Irma Stern for two reasons. Firstly, to make the point that Alexis beat Irma Stern to the then Belgian Congo by 3 years. He arrived in 1939, whereas Stern made 2 trips to the Congo, first in 1942 and again in 1946. And this spectacular, lush, verdant painting dates from her second trip in 1946. And we're so excited to have this work in the sale at the end of the month too, which is a semi-aside. But I love making this comparison because I think both artists were equally enthralled by their surroundings. Of course, they, I suppose, internalized what they were seeing in very different ways, but the intense modernist palette that they both used is certainly similar. Anyway, what is Alexis painting here, other than sort of 3 figures, potentially children? Of course, you get the idea of women or figures walking through markets with baskets or items on their heads. They're also related to the Mangbitu people that Alexis would have come into contact with at the time, a people that had a tradition of binding the skulls of their children to create these very elegant, elongated heads, which of course would have been, frankly, an enormous shock to Alexis. But this sort of planted a seed in his mind. And along with this barotse duck, this ceramic vessel that he picked up on his travels, this idea emerged of one of his first most important early motifs, the idea of an urn head, the idea of this concave cranium holding something precious, whether it's water or more symbolically the mind or the imagination. And this early work, 3 figures from the Congo, catches Preller at this moment where he's coming to terms and working through this idea to create this enormously iconic motif that, as I'll show you, starts in the late 1930s and can be tracked all the way through his career until his death in 1975. Anyway, Alexis happens to be in Lake Kivu on the 1st of September 1939 when the ultimatum expires and the world is at war. And he's terrified, naturally, and by hook or by crook, he eventually gets to the East Coast and back down to Pretoria, and he arrives back later that year. It takes him about 3 or 4 weeks to get back to Pretoria. Which leads us to the next work, also from that year, 1939, a very unusual nude. Again, in a wonderful period frame with a beautiful silk slip, but unusual in so many ways. Of course, you have that very African influence in the head, looking at African masks that he would have been exposed to firsthand on his travels up to the Congo. A very angular head, but a very fleshy human nude in terms of its body. There are lots of interesting things happening here, I think. If you look at that background, those wonderful blues and turquoises in those sort of twisting, flecked strokes, that is, of course, still Preller channeling Vincent van Gogh. This work is also a precursor to the one I'm showing on the right, a spectacular work from 1944 called Ophelia, or Girl with Red Hair, a work that you'll see made, nearly 2.3 million in our sale at the end of November 2016. Of course, it's a very similar template, a nude figure in sort of 3/4 view with an elaborate hairstyle, but there has been a lot happening between these 2 works. I'll try and explain what that is. Well, the most important thing is, of course, his wartime experiences. when Alexis got back to Pretoria, and despite being a pacifist, he felt obliged to join the service, and he joined the South African Medical Corps, and he went up to the North African campaign in 1940. He was there in 41, 42. He was taken a prisoner, went to Brookveld to Rommel's forces, and he spent time in POW camps all through the Middle East, North Africa and Italy. He eventually gets decommissioned and he returns to South Africa in 1943. And in that interim, a period where he practically did no artwork whatsoever, he makes this remarkable technical evolutionary step. The work he produces on his return from World War II is a big step up, not only technically, but in terms of the symbolic weight of his work. And I don't think there's another work that better exemplifies that than this. This is, of course, the incomparable Fleur de Mal from 1944. This encapsulates, I suppose, his wartime experiences. Being a medic, he was in those military tents on the front lines, trying to piece together these ripped and ruined and dying bodies. And Preller, being Preller, creates that horror, or turns that horror into something incredibly poetic and beautiful in a work like this. So you need to, as a starting point, take this ruined body lying on an operating table, and then transformed into something almost tattooed with these wonderful butterfly wings and petals. It's an incredibly powerful symbol of resurrection and restoration and healing. I won't read you that wonderful quote, but of course that really encapsulates what he was trying to do at the time. The work he produced from 1944 to about 1948 tends to be focused on his wartime experiences. So you have works like this on the left, Prisoner of War, which is at the National Museum of Military History, painted in 1945, I think it is, as well as one of my favorite early Preller works, Revelation, which also sold in that landmark sale in 2016. I love comparing it to the Congo forest scene by Irma Stern, not only because they were painted only months apart, but both of them are directly influenced by their experiences in the then Belgian Congo. Of course, the Preller work is a war work, but he is taking the Belgian Congo landscape, this lush tropical landscape, as a starting point. The war elements in this picture, of course, are in the landscape itself. That raw, ripped, fleshy pink, of course, calls to mind those ruined bodies that he would have seen on the operating tables. And he kind of conflates that wounded idea with this lush landscape. And you have this pink angel sort of moving across the space, and this parachute just falling from the sky, one already on the ground. And of course, we have no idea whether either figure is dead or alive. There's something really special going on in this comparison in terms of the artist's views on civilization, I think. You need to bear in mind what's going on, or what the European landscape looks like in 1945, 1946. It is ruined, ripped to shreds, dug up, bombed to pieces. Yet Stern is painting a wilder, lush, fleshy, beautiful, healthy landscape in the Belgian Congo in 1946. And there's a really interesting take on civilization in Africa compared to Europe in 1945, 1946. Anyway, 1948, a big year for Alexis for a number of reasons. Firstly, the National Party comes into power. A tighter conservative grip is felt around the country, and particularly for a gay man in Pretoria, Alexis is a little more rattled than normal. He also happens to have a catastrophic breakup with Christy Trutte at the time. He unsuccessfully tries to commit suicide. And frankly, he's a bit of a mess in 1947, 1948. And going on the advice of his sort of pseudo-godfather, Heg Pierneef again, he is encouraged to take himself to the Seychelles at the end of 1948, which he does. He goes to the Seychelles in 1848 and stays there until early 1949. He spends time in Beauvalon, and he is liberated in every way on the Seychelles. He is unknown. This is a part of Africa, an African spirit that he is previously unaware of. He's not only liberated in terms of his lifestyle, but of course in his palette and his art making. And that group of works related to the Seychelles is certainly one of the most collectible, smaller groups of Preller works. They include examples like the ones I'm showing you here, archaic sandals, on the left, and then probably the most hard-hitting work from that time, a head adapting itself to the unendurable, a quite magic, smaller scale work based on his experiences in Mahe and the Seychelles. But you start to see him working on a different symbolic level. You have this wonderful clear visor moving around the head, this disembodied head in this strange sort of deserted landscape, with these beautiful coral ribbons coming around towards the center part of his face. And you start to see this idea again developing of Preller focusing on the idea of protecting something fragile, starting off with those urn heads, moving into these sort of visor devices, and again using it as a metaphor for protecting something fragile, whether a flame or a mind or an imagination. Back in Pretoria in 1949, inspired by his Seychelles trip, but determined to paint in a more obviously African mode, Preller spends an increasing amount of time in the Mapogga villages or the Ndebele villages on the outskirts of Pretoria, along with people like Constance Stewart, the wonderful wartime photographer, photojournalist. I'm showing you here with some Ndebele figures, probably sometime in the 1940s, and these photographs are all by Constance Stewart. As I said, Preller was determined to develop his idea of some kind of pure African mystique. With a European background, he felt he didn't have the kind of entrenched, century-old traditional attachment to the continent, but it was a vision he wanted to develop, a vision he wanted to establish. And he used really these Ndebele villages and these Mapogga people as his starting point. And in 1948, he paints this work here, the Kraal, and this is number 2, the second version. The first version, I would argue, is maybe a lesser work. The second version is larger, and it's at the National Gallery in Cape Town. It is remarkable work, and we were lucky enough to sell one of the studies in our last Cape Town sale a month or 2 ago. But in a work like this, you see him starting with this Mapogga source material, but he's starting to bring in so many different African elements to start developing this kind of African iconography, this jargon or shorthand for his vision of the continent. So yes, you have these Ndebele elements, but you also have this Baga drum here, sort of West African, this Baga bird sort of at various points sort of punctuating the composition, this slit drum at the top here in this very phallic, oversized, almost totem drum that figures are moving around, and again, the emergence of the candle, again, something fragile that requires some kind of protection. At the same time, you start to see the magic of Preller emerging and his amazing imaginative range. Both of these works were painted at the same time. They both, of course, used the Mapogga village or the Mapogga figure as a source of inspiration, but one is far more literal and the other far more symbolic. The Ndebele village on the left, very much a stylized version of what he might have seen, yet the storm or the Mapogga woman on the left, a far more loaded symbolic painting, very much in the spirit of El Greco, with this giant figure, this female figure enveloped in this blanket in the foreground, with these beautiful little ndebele walls in the background, and this very atmospheric storm cloud brewing at the back. This leads me to the next lot, Head of Mapogga Woman from 1950. And this catches Alexis at this moment where he is very much entrenched in the Ndebele mystique, and he's continuing to develop various aesthetic solutions around it. This, I suppose, is a slightly more literal version, although, of course, it's directly related to this landmark paint in the kraal. You see this sort of edited head poking up from the bottom of the composition, the kraal, and you see it here in the work on offer as lot number 441, flipped around or inverted, but the same kind of slightly elongated head with these beautiful decorative marks down the nose, these sort of painted pink eyelids, and these other decorative rings and elements around the neck and hanging from the headdress. This is a really jewel-like quality work. And to me, related to a work like David, which is, again, arguably one of his most important mid-career works, in that it is, it shows his interest or his lack of fear in editing a composition. Just like David was edited at the knees and at the neck, so this Mapogga Woman is edited at the shoulders. I'm showing you the Revelation work too, because you'll notice that he's still working in a very similar palette, these dark red, greens and turquoises and blues, ultimately coming from his Congo visit, and these electric fleshy pinks in the background of both pictures. Again, when you talk about his dynamism in terms of overturning sources, developing sources, moving them forwards, making these amazing stylistic leaps, these three Mapogga works are a great example of that. Of course, the work we have on our sale is from 1950, the very atmospheric The Storm from 1948, which kind of ends in some of his most monumental works, his so-called Grand Mapogga series, which started in the mid-1950s and finished really about 1957, 1958. It's remarkable to me to see this kind of speedy stylistic movement in such a short time. African Head, lot 438, is the next work in our sale. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most important works on our auction. You'll see there from its very extensive exhibition history, as well as its various literature references in the admittedly small body of books on the subject, but this is a hugely important work. In many ways, it distills or encapsulates what Alexis had been working towards from about 1939 up until 1952, 1953. And it's painted at the exact same time, give or take a few months, as the famous collected images or orchestration of themes that we sold last year for the world record price of 10 million rand. But the reason I'm showing you them together is not only to draw your attention to the fact that they were painted at the same time, but more so that this is Preller at a moment where he has built his visual vocabulary. All his experiences up until this point have been distilled into these very Preller-esque icons and symbols that he uses in his storytelling for the rest of his career. And in this collected images, you'll see things like the Baga drum from the kraal in 1948. You'll see his stylized Mapogga figures over here, the candles, the eggs, the fish from the Seychelles Islands, the urn head, which he got the inspiration from in his Congo trip in 1939, the wonderful fetish embalmed on the right there from 1945, and it's all distilled in this kind of imagery. African head is also, as you can see, directly related to the gateway, which is one of his most important works from 1949. I think if you read any of the literature on Preller, Esme Berman, as well as Carl Nell, identified this work, The Gateway, as his first unique, iconic, Preller-esque and African-spirited example. So yes, it has these two mirror profile figures facing each other at the entrance of this little Ndebele kraal or Ndebele villages. There's a sense of a male and a female force, but you start to see these wonderful accessories, these beautiful sort of flat-bottomed clouds in the distance, these almost Karoo-like koppies, deserted landscapes, these little flowers, these petals that first appeared in his wartime works, and these stylized heads in profile, inspired, of course, by those urn heads from the Congo, as well as items like this, which is a little sort of East African Maasai ebony head that he collected on one of his trips, all feeding into this unique view on Africa. And again, here's another example of Alexis in a short period of time, from about 1948 to 1953, distilling these themes into completely different ways. So the idea of the imagination, again, being something protected, is obvious in a work called Christ Head in 1947, Head adapting itself to the unendurable from 1949, and of course our African head in profile from 1953. And that kind of theme is projected through other symbols like eggs being carefully protected in cardboard boxes. I mentioned at the beginning that African head has a companion piece, and it's the one I'm showing you on the right, also a work on panel, also an enormously important work. This one is at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan Museum, so of course will never go into the private sphere, will never come onto the market. So this is a unique opportunity of buying such an important work. More specific details, if you look at the wonderful fetish Enthralled from 1945, you'll see the similar eye, this very unnerving eye that Preller chooses for African head, which can also be seen as, I suppose, a fish eye. Because he painted this fish in 1952, as well as a very famous work called Mozartian Fish from the same period. I mentioned that these are one of the early works in his strict profile format. These profile portraits were very much in the mode of Quattrocento Italian examples, like the one I'm showing in the middle. That is, of course, Sandro Botticelli, that portrait dating from about 1475 or 1480. And the one on the left, one of his landmark early works called Girl with an Aureole from 1948. One of his first strictly profile figures. So I would argue there is a very direct link from Girl with an Aureole to African Head, painted 5 or 6 years later. Similarly, going through his career into the 1960s, you get to a work like this. This is, of course, the Gold Primavera, painted in 1967. And you'll see that symbolic strain moving through all these works, up until even the 1970s, where Preller creates his large-scale, enormously famous disembodied heads, like the Red Angel in the middle, which is now part of the Javert collection, and the one on the left, the fantastic Space Angel that we were lucky enough to sell, two months ago in the Cape Town auction. The point I'd like to make is there are few artists, certainly in the South African canon, that can pull a theme through decades, yet do it in such fresh terms. You'd maybe look at these works and imagine there might be different artists painted across different decades, but it is, of course, Preller working through his old influences and exposing himself to new ones, and continuously coming up with these sort of magic compositions. Into the 1950s, this is Rizzick Street in the early 1950s. I'm showing it to you because Preller gets his first major sort of parastatal or state commission in 1953. He gets employed to create a large mural for the South African Revenue, the Receiver of Revenue building in Rizzick Street in 1953. It also coincides with a European trip, and Preller for the first time comes face to face with the masterpieces in Rome, and specifically the Sistine Chapel. He also spends time in 1953 in Florence, in Venice. He visits Piero da Francesca's murals in Arezzo. He spends time in front of Etruscan murals in Tarquinia in Italy. And on his way back, he spends a couple of weeks in Egypt. He had last been in Egypt during the war, of course, so he was there under different conditions. But the influences of these stylized profile figures that he experiences firsthand in Egypt, of course, feed into his iconography. He spends 2 years working on the All Africa mural. This is it. It is vast. It is spectacular. It is still in the waiting room at the Receiver of Revenue, which is probably one of the reasons why it isn't visited very often or isn't particularly well known. It's still in pretty good condition, thankfully. But this is the work he produced between 1953 and 1955, and it provides the context, the immediate context for work like this called Shield on our upcoming sale. This would have been painted almost certainly at the same time. You see the same kind of strange and muted, almost endless background or endless horizons. These rather strange dorsals, fangs, pitchfork elements that Preller incorporates into his work. It's also the immediate context for this special painting called Surreal Minoan Bulls. It's painted in 1954, so smack bang in the middle of his All Africa mural commission. This is the work on the right in its frame, but this work has so many direct references to the major All Africa mural. If you look at them here, this is the right panel, and you'll see so many similarities. These sort of sky-reaching spines or spikes, these bamboo rods holding up these banners and flags and curtains are repeated here in Surreal Minoan Bulls. This drapery, very carefully decorated. The main element, though, is this group of 3 bulls that have been stylized, rigid now in their form, folded almost like origami figures, but on their surfaces beautifully decorated with these floral arrangements, these lovely contrasting colors of sort of coral and lavender and blues and pinks. They've got these stylized African masks as heads, and these outrageous scooped or scything horns sort of pointing heavenward. You also have these very strange sort of icicle elements, these tall decorative elements which are repeated certainly in the central panel of the All Africa mural. You'll also notice those flat clouds hanging in that background sky, similar to the clouds hanging behind the African head painted just a few months beforehand. The bull was a major figure for Alexis. Originally, he saw their mythological importance to the Ndebele people, more generally the Nguni people, seeing cattle as enormously valuable culturally, also as a symbolic link to their ancestors. And Preller paints various forms of ritualistic bulls from the 1940s, one of which is the work on the left, this magical jewel-like little work that we sold in 2016. It was about 7 by 9 centimeters in a wonderful Zaki Ilof frame with its Ndebele beading behind it, and all these stylized egrets, which were also links to the ancestors, sort of pointing upwards, drawing the eye up to the heavens. But in comparisons like this, again, I'd like to draw your attention to how Preller is able to take a single source and completely change it in such a short period of time. By 1954, just a few years later, his bulls are completely different. Of course, they're influenced by Minoan bulls, and specifically the jumping Minoan bulls on Crete, this very, very famous mural from Knossos. And similarly, in this ritual bull from a little bit later, from the 1960s, you see Preller giving this bull a more celestial presence, sort of hovering over this sort of sun disk below it, stylized again in a more Mediterranean, archaic form, but still always rooted in some element of African mysticism. I have to compare this work to examples by the likes of Giorgio de Chirico, the great sort of pseudo-surrealist. And I say pseudo-surrealist because I would argue that Alexis is also a pseudo-surrealist. The work on the right by de Chirico has so many similarities with the surreal Minoan bulls by Preller on the left. De Chirico was producing these kind of works early on in his career, sort of pre-World War I, but he returns to these kind of conceptions in the 1950s, and he is painting works like this at the exact same time that Alexis is painting his Minoan bulls in the mid-1950s. And I would like to think that the similarities scream out at you. These strange flat backdrops, these semi-empty skies, these strange horizons, this odd unnerving silence, these strange comparisons of scale, these very moody long shadows that the bulls or the columns throw, and of course a very, very similar kind of palette. But in both works there is a real sense of an archaic source, or a classical source. In Preller's case, it's very much African, whereas in de Chirico's case, it's very much Mediterranean, whether it's Roman or Greek. Which leads me on to a broader, more international question, which is, how does Preller fit into a surrealist dialogue? He always said he was a reluctant surrealist, whilst South African critics always defined him as a surrealist painter. He never did. I don't have an open and shut answer for you. I told you that he was not present when the International Surrealist Exhibition opened in 1936, and I'm showing you Salvador Dali in his scuba suit at the opening. He said he wanted to dive into the human subconscious. He struggled to breathe during the opening, and they had to sort of rip off the helmet, so he didn't die at the opening. But works by the likes of Max Ernst, René Magritte, Salvador Dali, of course, the iconic painters of surrealism, I would say have a very different conceptual source to Alexis. These out-and-out surrealist European artists, I think, had a more violent, avant-garde edge to their work. If you look at someone like Giacometti producing work like this on the left, as well as Yves Tanguy on the right, which is called Mama, Papa is Wounded, from about 1927. They had a harsher edge, I would argue, to Alexis's work. Alexis still had a gentle sense of Africa in his work that I think differs quite dramatically from the out-and-out surrealists. Of course, surrealism, which was condensed in André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, was more about sexuality, was more about psychoanalysis, dreamscapes. Preller, I don't think, delved into that kind of source material. As I've maybe hopefully tried to explain, his sources were more often on his doorstep, albeit the fact that they were entirely transformed in his own imagination. But of course, stylistically and purely aesthetically, of course, Alexis Preller fits into the international surrealist mode. You cannot say that this Mapogga figure from 1948 and this work by De Chirico are vastly different. They are painted at a similar time, and there's no doubt about it that both works would sit very comfortably next to each other in any major modernist gallery around the world. I'm nearly finished. In the late 1950s, of course, Alexis got his arguably most famous commission to paint the so-called Discovery mural for the Transvaal Administrative Building in Pretoria. It is now, as many of you will know, it has now been reinstalled at the Javits Centre in all its glory, all 12 meters of mural that took him 4 years to conceive and paint between 1958 and 1962. I'm showing you a detail like this just to emphasize how intricate and painstaking a project it was. He had to build a purpose-built gallery on his homestead in Dombeya to fit these massive, massive murals, and he was entirely preoccupied by this vast sort of career-defining mural scheme. And when he finishes that in 1962 and going into 1963, I think he is desperate for some kind of release, some kind of liberation. And I think he finds that in a stylistic shift, that he moves away from this very intricate, painstaking detail of the mural into a far more expressionist palette, much brighter palette, and starts to just rediscover the pure joy and tactility of painting. So he works, he produces works like the one I'm showing you here, Contrapuntal Figures 2 from 1964, that is very much based on Henry Moore forms, of course, but also on late works by Georges Braque, an example of which I'm showing you on the right. He also paints a remarkable group of works loosely termed or titled Temple of the Sun. And I'm showing you Alexis here in his bedroom in 1963, perhaps 1964. You see his campaign chairs, his altar in his bedroom with all his so-called household gods. And look at that remarkable painting behind him, hung low despite its vast size. And that work is this version of Temple of the Sun, which is in our auction at the end of the month. I'm just so delighted that we could find the exact work that Preller decided to hang in his own bedroom. Now, when I say I'm happy we could find the exact work, that's because there are a number of works titled Temple of the Sun by Alexis Preller. He exhibited 7 of them at an exhibition in 1963. A similar one I'm showing you on the left, this one called Gold Temple of the Sun. And it's sometimes very difficult to define or distinguish between the different versions of Temple of the Sun, bearing in mind critics, as well as the artist himself, tended to just loosely define them under the banner of Temple of the Sun. But what is going on here? Yes, he's working in abstraction. Yes, he's far more liberated in his mark making. But Preller being Preller, these are far more sophisticated pictures. They can, I think, and should be read as palimpsests, the idea of these ancient manuscripts being written and scrubbed out and rewritten and redrawn and scuffed out and redrawn over centuries. And again, it's very much some kind of a comment on century-long traditions, as well as the century-long development of civilization. And these 2 smaller abstract compositions, the one in gold and the gates, the latter one, Wilhelm, I think we'll be speaking about a bit more on Friday, all fall into this wonderfully exciting period of more expressive abstraction that Preller devises in the 1960s after his discovery panel. Panning across this Temple of the Sun, you'll get a sense of a language or a hieroglyphics scratched into the surface. And I think that's very definitely what the artist was thinking about when he produced a work like this. It develops into his so-called gesso works, one of which is the one I'm showing you on the right, his steely work. Gesso would have been used on the surface of the painting to create a ridged very tactile, textured surface, creating its own shadows that Preller developed at this time. And the little work, the shell, is a great example, although a rather small example of this phase of Preller's career. Of course, it develops into some of his most striking paintings, like the one I'm showing on the left, a work called The Creation of Adam 1, again, a work we sold in 2015, a work that I think held the record at the time until it was broken by Collected Images. But when you show these two works together, you can see that they are part of the same creative process, although of course the Creation of Adam far more spectacular, not only in color but in scale. You know, must have measured 1.4 meters across or something, if I remember correctly. To end off though, I suppose I thought I'd end with maybe one of the more difficult pictures to talk about, the little Preller shell that might be overlooked compared to some of the other sort of major headlining examples. It's a very small work, probably about 22 centimeters in height. But again, I would argue, shows again how Preller's entire imagination and output and iconographic career is always intermingled and intertwined. And no matter which example you start with, you can always go forward or backwards to pick up all the little references and links in his career. The shell on the left, which would have dated probably from the mid-1960s, compared to that Tower of Babel on the right, which is one of the last paintings he finished in 1975 for the Goodman Gallery show that he was never able to attend in person. But if you take that shell form, of course it's recreated in a spectacular conical spiraling form on the right. But if you go backwards, of course you can link it to his fantastic head with this sort of auric echo, this concept of a shell protecting something precious, all the way back to one of his most famous paintings, the Hierarchic Figures from 1955 at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, where he has conflated two of his most important sources, the shell and the Mapogga figure, enveloped them sort of into one, creating simply incomparable images in terms of the South African canon.